for joining us all the way from Singapore, literally halfway around the world, and it's daybreak for you there almost, right?
Yes,
Somewhat.
it is.
Yeah. Nice to see you again. I know it's been quite a few years. I honestly can't remember if I've seen you since. I think we had dinner or something like that in Los Angeles, probably 8 years ago, something like that.
It was around that time. Yes,
Yeah,
it's been
yeah.
a while.
So nice to see you again, and thanks for taking time to join us. We've been talking about classroom response questions and things like that. The other reading I gave the students was a terrible article that I wrote with students about 15 years ago on classroom response systems. But now we want to focus our attention on a better set of studies, which is the ones that you were involved in. And I told students, ask you about classroom response systems or other things. I know that you have done so much work, and one of the topics that we looked at a week ago was the effect of pre-questions. And I know that you've done studies on post-questions as opposed to pre-questions. So I might ask you a little bit about that too, just to throw a curveball at you if you don't mind.
Sure, whatever could be helpful. I'm happy to discuss.
So tell me a little bit, how'd you get started looking at sort of classroom response systems research?
Well, first, I think I looked at that in the context of retrieval practice research. As hopefully many of you know, that retrieval practice is perhaps one of the most potent ways to enhance learning and memory and other educational relevant outcomes that learning science has uncovered. But for many of us who have demonstrated these effects, we've done it in a very good way from a research perspective, which is, bring people into the lab, have them sit at a computer and have a very uh, artificial learning experience that doesn't translate very well to the classroom. We can't necessarily plonk every student in front of a specialized testing device that will deliver retrieval practice to them. And so classroom response systems are one way to do that in a more ecologically valid, portable uh, method. And so I first explored classroom response systems in the context of trying to deliver retrieval practice into an actual classroom environment. And then of course I later on used it in the context of my own teaching. But the first time was we used a system that was developed by Macmillan called iClicker. And so we had, this was at UC San Diego when I first tested out with a large lecture class of several hundred, I think 300, 400 students. And we wanted to deliver a retrieval practice. And it happened that at UC San Diego, many of these classes, these are sort of physical sciences classes, we would already have as a standard practice. It was in the bookstore, students could buy this iClicker remote. And so when I partnered with a lecturer in, I think it was one of the life sciences courses, and I told him, we'd like to investigate retrieval practice efficacy in that course. Do you think that the classroom response systems that you have already available, could they be used for this purpose? And he said, and I remember this lecturer was telling me, well, many students already have iClicker. I could just require it, and then we can go from there. And so for this particular quarter, in that at UC San Diego academic quarter, just made sure that his syllabus required these classroom response systems. And then across, I think, 8 weeks or so of the course, every week we would have clicker-based retrieval practice at various points in the lecture. And of course, for research purposes, we still did some things that are a little more contrived, like when the clickers were brought out, when he had his teaching assistants go around and check whether everyone had them properly set up and everyone was doing the actual work rather than just looking at each other's responses. And so the retrieval practice that was done was literally, the lecturer would project questions on the screen that related to what he was teaching, key concepts, and then he would have the students, respond with those clickers. and he would show the distribution responses in class. But critically, this was an opportunity for the students to engage in recalling, practicing their knowledge, retrieval literally of what the instructor was targeting. He did that across that multiple weeks of the course. And the fun thing, I should say, the exciting thing was that those clicker questions were highly effective. So when we gave high stakes exams in the course, the particular topics that had been subject to this iClicker based retrieval practice turned out to have significantly better performance. And this was weeks after the clickers had been used. And so this was a pretty compelling, now one of dozens of, more than dozens really, of classroom, authentic educational settings showing that classroom response system can be used to deliver a very effective learning strategy. And so that's one example that I like to point to. And then since then, for example, in my own teaching, I don't have clickers among my students per se, but we can move to other things that are even more portable. I use in my lectures use poll everywhere and other kinds of response systems where students don't even need, because now everyone has their laptops and they can just have that particular plugin and can just respond that way as well. And so I've also been able to deliver retrieval practice in my own lectures, but without clickers. It's still a classroom response system, just a different version. So those are at least two examples of using those systems. And I think those are one of the best ways not only to promote interactivity in the classroom, but to actually deliver strategies, which in the lab we've shown to be effective, but now we can actually deliver them in an authentic educational setting and achieve similar benefits.
Thanks, Stephen. I know you remember as well as I do when this notion of classroom response systems and iClickers, and it quickly kind of became like cotton swabs and Q-tips. Everybody just immediately started using the term clicker as opposed to classroom response system. They were all the rage at some point, right? This was the new latest technology that everybody should use because it promotes active learning and it engages students. And I mean, the list of great things associated with it was just, too long to mention. We don't see that very often now. This is anecdotally, but if we were to do a poll of, how much we saw classroom audience response systems being used, like, around 2012 versus today, I'm sure that it's not quite as popular. Why do you think, and you've just touted it as being an effective way. Why do you think some of these things, kind of they burst on the scene, they're all the rage, and even more rarely, this one has some empirical support behind it. Why do you think they kind of fade over time? Is it because they're not the newest, greatest, latest thing, or people get bored with them? How can you get bored with empirically supported teaching techniques?
Okay, well, I'm not sure of exactly what may cause it to wane in popularity. I would say at my institution, there is such a push for interactivity that there are still quite a lot widespread use of certain types of response systems. But the idea of effective approaches waning in popularity is a recurring theme, I feel, throughout a lot of the history of education. I think of at the history of certain types of literacy curricula that have waxed and waned over time, and sometimes they relate to not necessarily researcher initiated, but other areas initiated desires to change and move in different directions for whatever reason, such as, so I just go back to the evidence for retrieval practice, right? So retrieval practice being highly effective according to a wide range of research, but we see that there is this drive in many countries to get away from so-called testing students all the time. And so that has resulted in the adoption of well, moving away from highly effective strategies to less effective ones, which is arguably a shame because it really deprives students of learning approaches that are ones that will actually benefit them. Now, whether that applies, if that scenario applies specifically to reduced use of classroom response systems, at least maybe from my perspective, might require some more research, but perhaps it is because of this move from one fad to another, and this is no longer the latest shiny object, and we want to try something else. But sometimes, and one thing I like to say is that yes, there may be new technological developments. Right now, the rage is incorporating AI into the classroom in every possible way. But the human brain isn't suddenly hasn't changed. The principles of learning and memory, the principles of how to teach effectively to promote understanding, transfer, all these great learning outcomes isn't suddenly changing overnight. Human beings aren't suddenly radically different species. And so, yes, there are new technological innovations, there are new teaching techniques. I think it's probably more prudent to balance trying to change and adapt with the new innovation, with also an understanding of what are the principles from the science of learning and other research areas that elucidate what may actually be effective for learning.
Thank you. Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to student questions because they usually have better questions than I do. So first on the list is Mary. Would you like to go?
Hi, thank you.
Hello, hello.
The question I have is because even though maybe like you were saying, there are applications that everybody uses, and in my field, Cahoots became the rage. And I
It's
don't
very
like
popular
it.
here as well.
Yeah, I don't like it for a couple of reasons. The students that need more processing time, the students that are distracted very easily because there's an extrinsic load that is incredible with that application. So when you're doing the clicker, when you did this experiment, how did you monitor those that needed more processing time, or maybe they needed more time to read, especially the concept questions? And then I have one additional question after this.
Oh, okay. I want me to answer this one first. Sure.
Yes.
Okay, great point, because yes, trying to implement whether it's clickers or other response systems in a way that is equitable and that allows all students to participate without feeling left out is really important consideration. And so in my case, in that study, we kept that in mind in the sense that we didn't rush the students. And this was something actually I remember the lecturer involved when we were implementing this was saying, I don't want to leave students feeling like they couldn't answer in time. They were still thinking about the questions and we moved on. So he allocated enough time, and we agreed that he was going to wait for each question until the entire class had responded. And he could monitor that with the clicker system he had, which was really, really nice. He had his dashboard and he could see how many clickers were on in the classroom, and then you could see whether everyone had responded. And so that was very easy. And of course, the clicker system we use and the questions he had on the screen, it was a limited amount of material for people to go through. The cognitive load was probably not as severe as it would be with Kahoot, if they're looking at the display with all these different things. And so that's a very different kind of response system situation. So the way we did it again was the materials were presented and the time was allocated in a way that everyone had a chance to respond and we didn't rush them. But again, it was quite simple. And ultimately, in that case, the students had to just press one button to give their response. They didn't have to type anything or diagram something. And so that made it easier. What was your next question? I hope that
Okay,
answered it.
so,
The
no,
first
that
one.
did. That's
Yeah.
great that you did that. My second question is the same question that I had for Dr. Robinson a little bit earlier. You are using the word retrieval, whereas for
Yes.
me, multiple choice is recognition, not retrieval. And so do you consider recognition and retrieval to be just on a spectrum of each other? How do you view that? And
Great
does
question.
it really matter?
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So, and this is, by the way, a theoretical distinction that is also present in the research literature, because there are a number of researchers who historically have called multiple choice the same thing as a recognition test. So multiple choice, we go really more into the weeds about it. There's a spectrum within multiple choice. Some of it is truly is recognition. You know, which of these answer choices is the one I've seen before? But it is a spectrum in the sense that multiple choice tests can be constructed in very sophisticated ways. It often takes more time to do so. And maybe this may be obvious to some of you, but you can design them, for example, to be application questions, right? Where the answers are long sentences and it's no longer a matter of recognizing an option. It's a matter of sort of either process of elimination or even comparing one option versus another to see which one is more applicable. And so I've always tended to be a bit more nuanced about it. Some it is recognition, some it is more towards a recall or even application, interpretation, things like that. So it varies. Who's next?
Sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button. Rebecca, you're up next.
All right. So thank you for coming today. We really appreciate it. My question is really about the low stakes, no stakes versus high stakes. So we read two different types of articles, yours, and then in the other one, it showed that in clicker assessments, that when the stakes were too low, it didn't give any difference, and there was no significant difference in the testing later on. And so I wondered if it was specifically because with jargon, there's a need for the information in order for there to be understanding in that content, and that might change whether or not there has to be some other accountability involved, or just like your stance on when do you do no or very low stakes and when would more accountability be needed?
That's a great question as well. So, you know, from a researcher's side in the retrieval practice literature, it's been kind of an axiom that it should be low stakes in the sense that the goal for the students should be to just practice retrieval without feeling anxious about accounting for something which or affecting their grades, because there is a sense that, okay, that might almost interfere with the pure learning benefit when they're so obsessed with the consequences of making an error. And so most of the studies I'm familiar with, they have been low stakes, but you raise a very interesting point that maybe there are certain circumstances where actually adding some stakes could be maybe even necessary to foster a level of attention or a focus that would cause that would be necessary for students to engage in effective retrieval. Because one thing we do know about retrieval practice is that it's not just a matter of just going through the motions of oh, I think I know what this question is asking, but it's actually thinking deeply about it and arguably successfully retrieving what it is, the target information, and possibly doing that multiple times. And that is effortful and does require some degree of concentration and motivation on the part of the learner to actually go through that process. So even though the research studies that have been conducted in classroom settings, most of them have been low stakes, there is actually other evidence that in a sort of a non-research, not a particular experimental context, that just introducing quizzes, which can include high stakes quizzes in a classroom setting, that seems to also promote learning. So that raises the possibility that this sort of researcher sort of conclusion that it should be low stakes is not necessarily as necessary as we might have thought. And actually, so I'm sort of roundabout way of saying the researchers have done it with low stakes primarily, and it has been effective in many cases. So we kind of think, okay, well, that's it. That's the recipe for what works. But perhaps introducing some degree of stakes might be helpful. So that I would say that.
Thank you, Stephen. Alyssa, you are up next.
Hi. So
Hello.
I am an academic advisor at UTA, funny enough, but I work with freshmen primarily. I was curious, I posed this to Dr. Robinson too, but if you were to duplicate the study with the average current college student, both college ready and not college ready, would the outcomes still be similar?
I'm talking about the jargon retrieval practice study,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I tend to think, well, so I've gotten questions along those lines over the years, and I have historically given a researcher-based perspective, which is okay. Well, retrieval practice effects have been demonstrated across individuals of different background, prior knowledge levels, of different ability levels in various ways we may define that. And so if I were to sit people from different backgrounds in a classroom, have them listen to the same lecture, and have them use clickers to perform retrieval practice, at least based on that literature, most people would experience some benefit. Now, the magnitude of that benefit may vary, right? It could be a small one, but, for example, equivalent to a letter grade improvement versus, say, half a grade letter grade improvement. That's what I would say in the abstract. However, it is the case that there are many other factors that may not be figured into that research. For example, the learning or study strategies or study skills that students of different backgrounds may have, those that are better prepared for lecture-based learning than others, those may have other life circumstances that make learning more challenging. So I would say that although I'm cautiously optimistic that these effects would be found with different populations, there's actually also reason to not be 100% confident in that, and it would require actually testing out the strategy with the different persons before endorsing that it would work without qualification. And also, it might need to be tailored in different ways, right? So, those that might be less familiar with material, one thing about retrieval practice, they need to learn the material well enough to practice retrieving it. So maybe students who are less prepared, they might need extra practice. They might need review sessions where they study the material more often before they engage in retrieval practice. I still think in the end, retrieval practice will be effective for most people based on this massive body of literature that shows its effectiveness across different circumstances. But nonetheless, how it's implemented may need to be tailored.
Okay, so if you were to implement it today, would there be any changes to how you did the experiment?
Yeah, that's something that some colleagues and I have thought about over the years. And one thing that, at least for that particular study, which had a jargon terminology or scientific terminology as its emphasis, we have thought that maybe, in fact, moving it beyond a typical the instructor lectures and then we practice retrieval of it might be necessary to have larger benefits, particularly to make it more generalizable, transferable learning. And so we've considered things like making the learning more elaborate beforehand, such as having students maybe engage in some generative or active learning of the material before we practice retrieving. So, for instance, they could get a glossary to study, or they could, write out definitions in their own words. There's a variety of other things that could be perhaps paired with retrieval practice that I would consider, particularly based on the research in my lab over the past couple of years since that paper was published.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Amanda, you were up next.
I was specifically looking at a lot of the jargon part of it, where you said that there's a little research on productive ways to learn, and that also you hadn't done specific studies or included anything else to help learn jargon. Since then, has there been any more like looking into, or are you interested into looking at like different ways of learning jargon or teaching jargon and having students pick that up?
That's a great question. And I have, have these article alerts, and I try to keep up with the different research topics, including retrieval practice being, the mainstay. So I always have to be careful in saying that nothing has been done in the past couple of years, because usually somebody has done something somewhere that is relevant. So I'm not sure, 100% sure whether something else has been done, but going to the idea of what else can be done to improve the learning of these kinds of terminology. One thing that I think is relevant and kind of exciting is the research that's emerging on, well, it's not just emerging, but it's been going on for a long time, but there's new developments every year on ways to teach vocabulary, ways to learn language, and so on. And so just to give you an example, in my lab, we published a paper very recently, I think it was earlier this month, on using pre-testing to learn foreign language vocabulary. So here we have people, we present them with the foreign language term, which is a kind of like jargon, and we give them a picture of what it possibly might mean. We have them guess the meaning, and then we teach them what the meaning is. And we, in that paper, conducted a variety of experiments in which the sort of guessing with feedback for foreign language vocabulary resulted in better ability to recognize it, going back to the question earlier, as well as being able to recall it on a subsequent test. So that is something that is before we might do retrieval practice. Retrieval practice would be after it's been encoded and learned to some degree. This is a way sort of at the start of introducing terminology. And so possibly one way in the future that we might combine those things, right? You have people engage in this strategy beforehand to improve the learning of the terms, and then we can perform retrieval practice afterwards to help consolidate that learning. So that's one possibility.
Okay, because I was interested about that in like a practical sort of way, like because Brian might agree with me because I know he does nursing and stuff, like in a practical course where you have to be hands-on and you're using the jargon in that way. And I find, because I teach art, which is a little bit different, but I'm using the technical terms instead of like, I don't dumb it down, I guess, and that's what I like try to stick with, using the technical terms with my students. And I think that helps them garner that knowledge over time. And I think that's interesting to me. So I thought maybe
it almost sounds like you're immersing them in the language of that particular field.
Yeah.
And that again, one of the wonderful things about education more broadly, I think, is there's potentially many different ways to achieve positive outcome, and that may be one of them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Question.
Stephen, I want to be respectful of your time. We have, Darby, you lowered your hand. Do you have a quick question? We have a couple minutes left.
I was just mindful of the time, so I lowered my hand. I know Dr. Robinson had mentioned that you were studying post-testing, and so I was hoping you were able to maybe summarize some of your best practices around post-testing. I'm really interested in how we can best utilize data, how involved we should have students in that, like is going over a test post better? Anyways,
I think the term was post questions. Right,
post-questions.
you've looked at pre-questions, right? Asking questions before somebody reads, and then asking questions after. You want to talk just a little bit about that difference?
Oh, sure. Well, thanks for your question. And I kind of view pre-questions and post-questions are sort of two sides of the same coin in some ways. They're both using practice questions, but in different contexts, different stages of the learning process. So I alluded to a little bit of this idea of guessing in the prior question, and pre-questions are really guessing about information you haven't formally learned. So, at the start of a class, what do you know about X? And people may guess, and then, well, you find out in the lecture, or here's a hint, and then the pre-questions in this case are ways to introduce a topic. And we know actually much less about in terms of research about what are the best practice for using pre-questions. But seems to be that introducing a few of them at the start of a topic, and then crucially having a very clear way for the students to learn what the answers are to those questions is key to having any learning benefit. So oftentimes presenting those answers fairly soon afterwards seems to be an important best practice. But setting that aside, you talk more about post questions. So post questions then of course are afterwards. And we know much more about post questioning in the sense that that's after the formal instruction has occurred and you want to promote the consolidation of that information. You want to give learners an opportunity to exercise their knowledge that they've acquired, which will promote the long-term retention and potential use of that knowledge over the long term. So what are some best practice about that? Well, there are different ways of asking those questions. Right? So this is, I think, is kind of important. One of the things that if you've seen that jargon paper was that it was just sort of multiple choice questions, and there were different kinds, right? And although it depends on the subject, depends on various factors, but having questions that are not just, of course, depending again on your object. So there are many considerations, but across the literature, if you ask questions that require the learners to really think deeply about the material and retrieve in a way that is not just retrieve a small detail, but retrieve principle, idea, and connect it with the larger topic they're learning. So application questions, higher order questions, those tend to be more effective, at least broadly speaking. But again, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you want people to learn the definition of the jargon term, then maybe just asking them what does it mean? Very simple. If you want to ask people, want people to learn, I don't know, some theory and how it applies to various scenarios in real life, you might ask people those kind of deeper questions that require them to think about it. So there's that principle of post questioning is a type of question. And then another factor with post questions is the frequency and placement of those questions. So for instance, you can ask it right after the lecture, but it might actually be helpful to ask it a couple times and across different time points. So maybe not right after the lecture where it's really easy for the students to say, oh, well, you just mentioned that, so I totally can answer that question. Maybe engage in post-questioning a week later, maybe even a month later. Well, not anecdotally, but there are some researchers that initially they were trying to explore exactly what is the recipe for how many times you do this post-questioning. And there ultimately hasn't been a very sort of explicit answer, but if you have people retrieve through a post-question a particular concept or idea one time, they should probably do it 2 or 3 times on different occasions. And that seems to be the biggest bang for the buck, if you will, for post questions. So I've just mentioned types of post questions and the frequency of post questions. Those are some of the best practices, at least according to research, that seem to be the way to juice out the best effects of post questions. Now, pre-questions, as I mentioned, we're still trying to figure out. So I mentioned feedback, timing, or at least learning the correct answers as being a best practice there. But we have much more to go in terms of exploring how best to use those in the classroom.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to be respectful of your time, and of course, these students, they've been sitting through quizzes already and a half hour of listening to me. The best part of the class is listening to you. And so anyway, thank you so much for your generosity. I know you don't need to start something at 7:15 a.m. To join us or whatever, but we certainly appreciate that. And I hope to cross paths with you again sometime. I'm not sure how that will happen, but it was great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Ed. Will you be at this economics meeting later this year?
San Diego, November. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I'll be there. So
Okay,
perhaps
I'm gonna make an
we'll cross
effort to
paths
go.
then.
I may have all these students kick in some money in a GoFundMe so I can afford to go there. So,
Of course.
all right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. You
All
have
right,
have a
you
good
too.
day. The rest of you have a good night. Take care.
All right.
Thank you.